You should be extremely afraid. The guy you work for is an evil person.
Thank you for bringing us collectively to this moment. It is a moment.
Your time to go.
You finished, Mr. Brock.
Was that a threat?
You had to learn, Porter. I follow people that do not want to be followed. What about
Between human and symbiote is the key to our evolution.
whoever you are?
I work at the Life Foundation, and I need your help.
What? Do we have a deal?
I'm feeling really sick.
Our Venom.
You should be extremely afraid.
वेनम हीरो है या एंटी हीरो, इस मूवी के शॉकिंग फैक्ट्स और ऑनेस्ट रिव्यू में जानिए वेनम की असली कहानी। सिर्फ रिव्यू वाला पर वीडियो एंड तक देखो क्योंकि वेनम का बेस्ट फैक्ट मिस नहीं करना। Venom is a 2018 American superhero movie based on the Marvel Comics character Eddie Brock, also known as Venom. It was the first movie in Sony's Spider-Man universe, also known as the SSU. The movie was directed by Ruben Fleischer, with the screenplay written by Jeff Pinkner, Scott Rosenberg, and Kelly Marcel. Tom Hardy plays both Eddie Brock and Venom, while Michelle Williams, Riz Ahmed, Scott Hayes, and Reed Scott also star in the movie. The story follows Eddie Brock, a struggling journalist whose life gets completely turned upside down when he becomes the host of an alien symbiote named Venom. This alien creature gives Eddie some serious superpowers. But there's a catch. The symbiote species has plans to invade Earth. After Venom appeared in Spider-Man 3 back in 2007, Sony Pictures tried to make a spin-off movie focused on the character. However, the project got stuck because Sony was still dealing with its plans for the Spider-Man movie franchise. Then, in March 2016, Sony started working on a brand new version of the movie. The idea was to create a new shared universe featuring Marvel characters that Sony had the movie rights to, even if Spider-Man himself wasn't the main focus. At first, Sony wanted Venom to be connected to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, especially the world introduced in Spider-Man Homecoming. But things eventually changed, and the studio decided to keep Venom more separate from Spider-Man. Sony's Columbia Pictures produced the movie with Marvel Entertainment. In March 2017, Scott Rosenberg and Jeff Pinkner were brought in to work on the script. A couple of months later, Ruben Fleischer joined as director, and Tom Hardy came on board as the lead actor. Kelly Marcel later joined the project to rewrite and improve the screenplay. Filming for Venom took place between October 2017 and January 2018. Production was shot in several major cities, including Atlanta, New York City, and San Francisco. The movie took a lot of inspiration from the Marvel comic stories Venom, Lethal Protector from 1993, and the Planet of the Symbiote storyline from 1995. The movie's music was composed by Ludwig Göransson, who had already worked on another Marvel movie, Black Panther, which came out earlier in 2018. Venom had its premiere at the Regency Village Theatre on October 1, 2018, and then hit theaters across the United States on October 5, 2018. Critics were mostly pretty negative about the movie, but Tom Hardy's performance got a lot of attention, especially his chemistry and unusual relationship with Venom. The movie ended up being a huge hit with audiences and made around 856.1 million worldwide. It became the seventh highest grossing movie of 2018 and also broke several box office records for movies released in October. Even though critics weren't exactly loving it, Venom built a strong fan base and became an important movie for Sony's superhero universe. The success of the first movie led to two sequels. The first sequel, Venom, Let There Be Carnage, came out in 2021, followed by Venom, The Last Dance in 2024. While searching space for new planets where humans could potentially live, a probe from the Life Foundation, a bioengineering company, discovers a comet covered with strange alien life forms called symbiotes. The crew manages to bring four symbiote samples back to Earth, but things go sideways when one of them escapes and causes the spaceship to crash in Malaysia. Search teams arrive at the crash site, but they can't find the escaped symbiote anywhere. The crazy part is that one of the astronauts from the ship is somehow found alive near the wreck. The astronaut is loaded into an ambulance and taken toward a hospital, but the symbiote secretly takes over the astronaut's body and causes the ambulance to crash. The symbiote then leaves the astronaut's body and takes over a nurse instead. It discovers that it can heal damaged human bodies and starts moving from one person to another. While searching for a way back to the Life Foundation, it notices the company's logo and follows the trail. The symbiote is extremely hungry and needs human bodies to survive, so it keeps jumping from one person to another while making its way toward its destination. Meanwhile, the Life Foundation manages to recover the other three symbiote samples and takes them to its research facility in San Francisco. The company is run by Carlton Drake, a super smart inventor and the CEO of the Life Foundation. Drake has become obsessed with the symbiotes and wants to figure out how they can be used to help humanity. During his research, Drake discovers that the symbiotes can't survive on their own for long. They need hosts that breathe oxygen. The problem is that most humans reject the symbiotes, and the process usually ends up killing the host. Basically, the symbiote and the human body have to be a perfect match, kind of like how organ transplants require the right match between a donor and a patient. Meanwhile, investigative journalist Eddie Brock is looking into Carlton Drake and the Life Foundation. Eddie finds out about Drake's secret human experiments through a classified document that belongs to his fiancée, Anne Weiing. Anne is a lawyer who is working on a legal case involving the Life Foundation. Eddie decides to confront Drake and accuses him of using his massive space and pharmaceutical businesses to fund his secret experiments. Eddie discovers that Drake is targeting some of the most vulnerable people in society for drug and symbiote testing. The Life Foundation promises these people money in exchange for participating, but many of them end up dying during the experiments. Eddie exposes Drake during an interview, but this move completely destroys his career. Eddie loses his job, and Anne also loses her job because of the situation. On top of that, Anne ends their relationship, leaving Eddie completely crushed. During this rough period, Eddie often visits a local convenience store owned by Mrs. Chen. One day, the store gets robbed, and Eddie is too scared to do anything except hide. Mrs. Chen, however, continues to support Eddie and becomes one of the few people who genuinely cares about him. 6 months later, Carlton Drake is getting closer to making human symbiote bonding work. One of Drake's scientists, Dora Skirth, has just finished testing the symbiotes on rabbits. Drake wants her to move on to human testing, but Skirth thinks it's way too soon. Skirth understands how dangerous the experiments are. She knows that the human host and the symbiote need to be a perfect match. If they aren't compatible, the human body rejects the symbiote and the person dies. That means Drake could end up killing a huge number of people before finding the right match. Drake has a completely different mindset. He believes that if humans can successfully bond with these alien creatures, they might also gain the ability to survive in outer space. Since the symbiotes can survive in space, Drake thinks humans could potentially do the same if they become compatible with them. Drake plans to use human test subjects during the next phase of the experiments to see whether they can survive in space while carrying a symbiote inside their bodies. Dora Skirth has had enough of Drake's methods. She doesn't agree with randomly choosing people and putting their lives on the line just to make his experiments work. She decides to secretly contact Eddie Brock and help him expose Drake. Scar tells Eddie that she's scared to go to the police because she believes Drake could hurt her or even target her family. She also reveals something huge. Drake's space probe didn't just bring back random samples. It brought alien life forms back to Earth. Skirth helps Eddie break into the Life Foundation's research facility so he can find proof of Drake's illegal experiments. While inside, Eddie discovers that a homeless woman he knows, Maria, has become one of Drake's test subjects. Eddie tries to save Maria, but she suddenly attacks him. The symbiote living inside her jumps from her body into Eddie's. Maria dies, leaving Eddie with no idea what just happened to him. Eddie manages to escape from the facility, but something has definitely changed. He suddenly has incredible strength, speed, and agility. At the same time, his body starts acting seriously weird. He becomes insanely hungry, starts eating food from dumpsters, and even drinks water from a toilet. Things get even crazier when Eddie starts hearing a strange voice inside his head. Confused and freaked out, Eddie goes to Anne for help. Anne is now dating Dr. Dan Lewis, who examines Eddie. During the examination, Dan discovers something unbelievable. An alien symbiote is living inside Eddie's body. Back at the Life Foundation, Drake discovers that Skirth betrayed him. He forces her to reveal the name of the person she brought into the facility. Drake then exposes Skirth to another captured symbiote as punishment. The experiment goes horribly wrong, and the symbiote eventually dies. That leaves the symbiote inside Eddie as the only known surviving specimen. Drake isn't about to let that happen. He sends a group of heavily armed mercenaries after Eddie to capture the symbiote and bring it back to the Life Foundation. But the symbiote has other plans. When the attackers corner Eddie, the creature fully reveals itself. It forms around Eddie's body and transforms him into a massive, terrifying monster. The symbiote fights the mercenaries and protects Eddie from bullets and other deadly attacks. Eddie escapes the city and takes shelter outside the area. That's when the symbiote finally talks directly to him and introduces itself as Venom. Venom explains that the comet Eddie heard about wasn't just some random space rock, it was basically an invasion force. The symbiotes are traveling through space looking for new planets where they can take over living creatures, consume them, and eventually conquer the entire world. Venom tells Eddie that his original plan was to help the other symbiotes invade Earth. In exchange for Eddie's cooperation, Venom promises to let him live. At first, Eddie is obviously freaked out by the whole situation, but he slowly starts enjoying the powers Venom gives him. Eddie now has superhuman strength, insane speed, enhanced reflexes, and the ability to survive injuries that would normally kill a regular person. Eddie decides to expose Drake's crimes by breaking into his old workplace and delivering the evidence he has collected. But as soon as he tries to leave, SWAT officers surround the building. Eddie has no choice but to transform into Venom again. He fights his way through the building and escapes while showing off the insane abilities he now has. Annie happens to witness Eddie transforming into Venom, and she realizes that something seriously crazy is going on with him. She takes Eddie to Dr. Dan's office so they can figure out what's happening. Dan examines Eddie and discovers that the symbiote is slowly damaging his internal organs. Eddie also explains that Venom has two major weaknesses: extremely loud, high pitched sounds and fire. Venom claims that the damage to Eddie's body is simply part of their bonding process and can be fixed. But Anne isn't willing to take that chance. She uses an MRI machine to weaken Venom. The intense sound and energy from the machine becomes too much for the symbiote, allowing Eddie to separate from it. But Eddie doesn't get much time to enjoy being free. Drake's men arrive and capture him. Meanwhile, the fourth symbiote, Riot, has been making its way from Malaysia all the way to San Francisco. Just like the first symbiote, Riot survives by jumping from one human body to another. Eventually, Riot finds Carlton Drake and bonds with him. Drake is thrilled because Riot is much more powerful and experienced than the other symbiotes. Drake agrees to help Riot return to space using a Life Foundation probe. Their plan is to collect the remaining symbiotes and bring them back to Earth so they can begin their invasion. Meanwhile, Anne realizes Eddie is in serious danger, she reluctantly bonds with Venom herself so they can break Eddie out. Once Eddie and Venom are reunited, Venom explains that something has changed. After spending time with Eddie, he has started to understand humans and the importance of protecting Earth. Venom no longer wants to help his species destroy the planet. Instead, Venom decides to fight against his own kind. Eddie, Venom, and Anne team up to stop Riot and Drake. They chase them to the launch site, where Drake and Riot are preparing to take off in the Life Foundation spacecraft. The battle gets completely out of control. Venom fights Riot while Eddie tries to stop the spacecraft from launching. During the fight, Venom manages to damage the probe as it takes off. The spacecraft explodes, killing both Riot and Carlton Drake. After the explosion, Anne believes Eddie is no longer bonded with Venom. She also thinks Venom died in the blast. But that's not actually what happened. Venom secretly survives and remains bonded with Eddie. Now, Eddie and Venom have become an unlikely team. Instead of helping the symbiotes take over Earth, they decide to protect the city from dangerous criminals. Eddie also gets his journalism career back on track. Later, he gets a huge opportunity when he is invited to interview a dangerous serial killer named Cletus Kasady in prison. During their conversation, Kasady hints that he plans to cause complete chaos if he ever gets out. He promises that there will be carnage. The central figure in the casting of Venom 2018 was Tom Hardy, who took on the dual role of investigative journalist, Eddie Brock, and the alien symbiote Venom. Hardy's attachment to the project came together rapidly in 2017 after he departed from J.C. Chandor's Triple Frontier. Sony Pictures, recognizing an opportunity to secure an in demand actor whose personal connection to the material aligned with the studio's ambitions for a standalone anti hero film, moved quickly to bring him aboard. Hardy's young son was an avid fan of the Venom character from the comics, and this familial enthusiasm played a significant part in the actor's decision to accept the part. He received a reported $7 million for his work on the film. To prepare physically, Hardy undertook 5 weeks of intensive training in mixed martial arts, boxing, and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, building the stamina and physical presence required for the more visceral sequences in which Eddie and the symbiote interact with the world. Hardy's approach to the dual performance was shaped by earlier experiences, particularly his work as the twin Cray brothers in Legend 2015. He recorded Venom's dialogue each morning before filming, then listened to those pre recorded lines through an earpiece while performing as Eddie. This allowed him to argue, banter, and react in real time with the symbiote's voice. Sound technicians, including Patrick Anderson and production sound mixer Michael Beekoff, coordinated the playback so that Hardy could cue and interrupt himself fluidly. Other actors on set heard the Venom tracks as well, but were instructed to treat them as part of the scene's reality while ignoring the technical apparatus. Hardy has described the process as a Tetris puzzle, requiring precise timing and an almost improvisational flexibility within the framework of the recorded material. The resulting vocal performance for Venom drew on a blend of influences that Hardy has publicly cited. The cadence and energy of rappers such as Redman, Busta Rhymes, and Method Man, the lounge lizard swagger of James Brown, and elements of Richard Burton's stoicism. For Eddie himself, Hardy layered in a neurotic, somewhat Woody Allen-esque quality mixed with the explosive physicality associated with fighters like Conor McGregor. The combination produced a restless, reactive leading performance that became one of the film's most discussed elements. Director Ruben Fleischer and the producers allowed Hardy considerable freedom to reshape dialogue and even certain physical beats. One widely reported example occurred on a restaurant set that featured a lobster tank. Hardy decided mid production that Eddie should climb into the tank. The design team reinforced the structure overnight and stocked it with prop lobsters so the improvisation could be captured the following day. Hardy also collaborated closely with screenwriter Kelly Marcel, who continued refining Eddie and Venom's lines throughout the shoot. This collaborative atmosphere was possible because Hardy had been secured early enough in pre production to influence the tone of the dual characterization from the ground up. The casting of the primary antagonist, Carlton Drake, who later bonds with the Riot symbiote, followed a competitive process. In August 2017, Riz Ahmed entered talks for the role. Prior to his selection, the studio had considered several high profile actors, including Pedro Pascal, Matt Smith, and Matthias Schoenaerts. Ahmed's casting brought a different energy, an intensity and intellectual sharpness that suited Drake's public persona as a visionary tech entrepreneur whose moral compass has drifted into dangerous experimentation. Ahmed approached the character as someone driven by a genuine, if warped, desire to secure humanity's future through radical scientific means, a framing that Fleischer endorsed. The actor's background in both independent drama and larger commercial projects allowed him to shift between charismatic public appearances and the colder, more calculating private scenes without losing coherence. Michelle Williams joined the production in September 2017 in talks for the role of Anne Weying, Eddie's former fiancée and a successful attorney. Williams had been drawn to the project in part by the prospect of working opposite Hardy, whose performances she admired. The character of Anne carries significant comic book history, including her eventual transformation into She-Venom. Williams has noted that the possibility of exploring that aspect was an additional attraction, even though the 2018 film only teases the idea in a brief sequence. Tatiana Maslany and Lashana Lynch were among those who had been considered or auditioned for roles in the film around the same period. Williams brought a grounded, emotionally precise presence that contrasted with Hardy's more kinetic style, creating a believable residual connection between the former couple even after their professional and personal fallout. Her line, I love you, but I love myself more, delivered during a key confrontation, was reportedly an addition she introduced, reflecting broader cultural conversations of the time while remaining true to Anne's self respect. Supporting roles filled out the ensemble through the autumn of 2017. Jenny Slate was cast as Dr. Dora Skirth, a Life Foundation scientist whose growing moral discomfort leads her to help Eddie infiltrate the facility. Slate's comedic background and dramatic range allowed her to portray a character who is both professionally competent and increasingly horrified by the experiment she has enabled. Reed Scott took the part of Dr. Dan Lewis, Anne's new partner and a physician who becomes an unexpected ally when Eddie's symbiote related symptoms escalate. Scott's dry, understated delivery provided a calm counterpoint to the chaos surrounding Eddie. Scott Hayes was brought on as Roland Treese, Drake's ruthless head of security. Hayes' intense physicality and ability to project quiet menace made him an effective on-screen enforcer. Additional key supporting players included Melora Walters as Maria, a homeless woman who briefly hosts the Venom symbiote before it transfers to Eddie, Peggy Lou as Mrs. Chen, the convenience store owner who develops an unlikely rapport with Eddie and later with the bonded duo, and Woody Harrelson in a mid-credits cameo as Cletus Kasady, the serial killer who would become central to the sequel. Harrelson's appearance was kept tightly under wraps during production and marketing, functioning as a direct setup for future storytelling. Chris O'Hara appeared as astronaut John Jameson, credited in some sources with a JJ. Jameson, the third designation in the context of the probe's mission, whose brief possession by Riot advances the symbiote's journey to San Francisco. Emilio Rivera played Richard, a lobby guard and acquaintance of Eddie's, while Sam Medina portrayed a street thug who becomes one of Venom's early victims. The broader supporting and background cast was extensive, reflecting the film's urban San Francisco setting and the Life Foundation's corporate and laboratory environments. Actors such as Soap Aluko and Wayne Pere appeared as Life Foundation scientists. Michelle Lee played a Malaysian EMT who temporarily hosts Riot. Kurt US served as a mission control translator, and a range of performers filled roles as security personnel, villagers in the Malaysian sequences, bar patrons, reporters, and laboratory staff. These included Roger Yuan as a village eel shop owner, Woon Young Park, and Patrick Chanda Chu as local toughs, Vicky Eng as an elderly village woman, who also hosts Riot, Mac Brandt as bartender Jack, Nick Thune as a bar regular, Scott Deckert as Eddie's noisy neighbor Ziggy, and Lauren Richards as Ziggy's girlfriend. Jared Bankins appeared as Isaac, one of the symbiote hosts, while Lucas Fleischer, related to the director, played a gate guard. The depth of the day player and featured extra roster contributed to the lived-in quality of the San Francisco and laboratory sequences. John Pepsidera served as the film's casting director. Pepsidera, known for his long collaboration with directors such as Christopher Nolan and for work on projects ranging from the Dark Knight trilogy to Zombieland, also directed by Fleischer, brought a track record of assembling casts that balance star power with character actors capable of elevating genre material. His involvement helped ensure that even smaller roles carried distinct personality, preventing the film's large ensemble from feeling generic. Extras casting was handled in part by Rose Locke, with associates including Caitlin Well and Marissa Blair, supporting the volume of background performers required for crowd, laboratory, and street scenes. The casting choices collectively shaped the tonal balance of Venom. Hardy's eccentric, dual voiced performance anchored the film in a register that mixed body horror elements with dark comedy and action. Ahmed's intellectual intensity gave the primary antagonist a contemporary edge rooted in tech, industry hubris, rather than pure cartoon villainy. Williams provided emotional ballast and a link to the character's comic book romantic history. The supporting ensemble, Slade's conflicted scientist, Scott's pragmatic doctor, Hayes' enforcer, Walter's tragic host, Lou's warm neighborhood presence, and Harrelson's brief but pointed cameo, created a network of relationships that grounded the more fantastical symbiote mythology. Cameos and uncredited appearances, including Stan Lee as a dog walker who exchanges a few words with Eddie, further connected the film to Marvel's broader screen tradition without overloading the narrative. Physical and technical demands of the roles influenced casting as well. Hardy's willingness to perform extensive physical work, including the lobster tank improvisation and the stunt oriented sequences in which Eddie is controlled by Venom, was essential. Stunt doubles and a tall stand in, approximately 6'7", were used for certain Venom physical shots. Since the fully realized CGI creature stood roughly 7'6", and the facial anatomy of the symbiote did not map cleanly onto Hardy's features for motion capture purposes. The decision to forego traditional full body motion capture for Venom itself meant that Hardy's performance as Eddie remained the primary live action reference, with animators extending his body language, shoulder rolls, and movement patterns into the larger, more fluid form of the symbiote. This approach placed a premium on an actor who could deliver a complete, self contained dual performance without relying on a second performer in a motion capture suit for the alien half. Riz Ahmed's casting also carried implications for the film's visual and thematic texture. As Drake, he had to embody both the polished public face of a billionaire innovator and the private figure willing to subject human subjects to lethal experimentation. The eventual bonding with Riot required him to convey a shift from controlled ambition to a more primal shared hunger. Michelle Williams' presence, meanwhile, allowed the film to retain a thread of romantic and professional history that could be reactivated when Anne briefly hosts the symbiote herself, an Easter egg moment that Fleischer and the producers kept under wraps until release. Williams has spoken of the appeal of expanding her range into superhero territory while still playing a character with agency and self regard. The secondary cast reinforced the world building. Peggy Lou's Mrs. Chen became a recurring touchstone of everyday San Francisco life that persists across the Venom series. Her scenes with Eddie providing moments of relative normalcy and later of dark humor once Venom is involved. Melora Walters' brief turn as Maria established the lethal stakes of symbiote possession early in the story. The various riot hosts, ranging from the Malaysian EMT to villagers and the elderly woman, illustrated the symbiote's body hopping nature and the global reach of the Life Foundation's retrieval efforts. Background performers in laboratory, security, and street settings populated the film's action set pieces without drawing focus from the principals. Throughout the casting process, the production balanced the need for marquee names capable of carrying a major studio release with the requirement for actors who could handle the specific demands of a hybrid body horror Takasian comedy tone. Hardy's early attachment set the creative center of gravity. The subsequent selections of Ahmed, Williams, Slade, Scott, and Hayes filled out a core ensemble that could support both the interpersonal drama and the escalating spectacle. Smaller roles and cameos were chosen to add texture, continuity with Marvel's cinematic presence, and seeds for future installments. The result was a cast that, while not without its detractors among critics, proved commercially robust and sufficiently distinctive to launch a trilogy. Hardy's preparation extended beyond physical training into vocal and psychological territory. He has described developing Venom's voice partly from playful impressions he performed at home with his dog, then refining it through the hip hop and soul influences already noted. The practical on-set method of pre-recording and earpiece playback required discipline and technical coordination, but it also granted him an unusual degree of control over the timing and emotional color of the dual conversations. Other actors adapted to this process, treating the unseen or partially visualized Venom as a fully present scene partner. This collaborative discipline among the cast helped sell the central relationship that drives the narrative. The casting of Woody Harrelson as Cletus Kasady, though limited to the mid-credit scenes, carried long-term strategic weight. Harrelson's established screen persona, capable of both affable charm and sudden menace, positioned the character effectively for the larger role he would assume in the sequel. Keeping the appearance secret during the marketing campaign maximized its impact for audiences who stayed through the credits. Similarly, the decision to include a brief animated clip from Spider Man Into the Spider Verse after the credits, featuring the voices of Shamik Moore and Jake Johnson, served as a playful cross promotional gesture without requiring additional live action casting. In assembling the full company, the production also attended to practical considerations of location shooting. Filming took place primarily in Atlanta, standing in for San Francisco interiors and some exteriors, with additional work in New York and on location in San Francisco itself. The San Francisco sequences, Russian Hill, North Beach, Chinatown, the financial district, required local background performers and featured extras who could populate the city's distinctive streets and neighborhood authentically. The Malaysian village and recovery sequences demanded performers who could convey the disorientation and physical toll of successive riot possessions. These location specific casting needs were met through a combination of principal supporting actors and carefully selected day players. The overall casting strategy reflected Sony's intention to launch a new shared universe of Marvel characters outside the main Spider Man continuity while still retaining some connective tissue through cameos and tone. By centering the film on Hardy's dual performance and surrounding him with actors who could match his intensity or provide complementary textures, the production created a self contained story that nonetheless left clear pathways for continuation. The ensembles range from Hardy's restless anti hero to Ahmed's visionary antagonist, Williams's grounded attorney, and the varied supporting players gave the film its particular mixture of pulp energy, occasional pathos, and dark humor. That mixture, for better or worse, became inseparable from the identities of the actors who embodied it. Further layers of the cast included uncredited or briefly seen performers who filled specialized functions. Christian Convery as a young boy, various laboratory technicians, SWAT team members, prison guards in the Kasadi sequence, and street pedestrians. Ron Cephas Jones appeared uncredited as Eddie's former boss. These contributions, while not spotlighted in marketing, help maintain the density of the film's urban and institutional environments. The casting department's ability to source performers who could deliver naturalistic reactions under the unusual conditions of symbiote related action and visual effects work was a quiet but essential component of the production's success in realizing its ambitious hybrid tone. In sum, the casting of Venom 2018 was defined by the early and decisive attachment of Tom Hardy, the competitive selection of Riz Ahmed and Michelle Williams for the other principal roles, the assembly of a capable supporting ensemble under John Papsidera's direction, and the careful integration of cameos and background performers who expanded the film's world without diluting its focus. The process unfolded across the second half of 2017, coinciding with script refinements and pre production design, and resulted in a company of actors whose individual strengths and collective chemistry shaped the finished film's identity. Venom 2018 production, release, and reception, production, development, and pre production. The road to Sony's 2018 Venom film stretched back more than 2 decades before the movie ever reached a theater screen, and the character's cinematic journey is almost as tangled as the symbiote itself. As early as 1997, filmmaker David S. Goyer had already drafted a script built around the Marvel villain turned antihero, with New Line Cinema attached to produce. Action star Dolph Lundgren was reportedly circling the lead role at the time, and the project was conceived with Carnage serving as the story's chief antagonist. That version of the film never got off the ground, and when the movie rights to Spider Man and his Rogues Gallery, Venom included, eventually landed at Sony Pictures, the character's future shifted along with them. Venom's alter ego, Eddie Brock, made his first appearance on the big screen in Sam Raimi's Spider Man 3 in 2007, portrayed by Topher Grace. Grace was originally supposed to have only a minor presence in that film, but his role expanded considerably into a full villain arc as both Eddie and Venom. According to reporting at the time, producer Avi Arad pushed for this change because he felt the trilogy had leaned too heavily on villains that Raimi personally gravitated toward rather than the antagonists that contemporary comic readers actually wanted to see on screen. Raimi himself had reportedly been reluctant to give Venom much screen time, citing what he saw as a lack of humanity in the character. Despite his own hesitation about the character's role in Spider Man 3, Arad was sufficiently confident in Venom's box office potential that he announced plans for a standalone Venom spin off film in the summer of 2007. By the middle of 2008, Sony was developing that spin off in parallel with further Spider Man 3 sequels, hoping Venom might do for their franchise what the Wolverine character had done to extend the life of Fox's X Men series. Screenwriter Jacob Estes produced an early draft, though Sony ultimately moved away from his take in search of a different creative direction. Estes' script had reimagined Eddie as a would be hero paired with a scrappy waitress sidekick named Honey Horowitz, pitting him against an opera obsessed version of serial killer Cletus Cassidy, who would transform into Carnage after biting Eddie. Estes had written the part with Grace in mind to reprise the role, envisioned Martin Donovan as Cassidy, and considered both Rashida Jones and Maya Rudolph for Honey. Sony, however, wasn't yet sold on Grace carrying a film as the lead. That September, the studio brought on screenwriting duo Paul Wernick and Rhett Reese to take another crack at the script. At around the same time, Venom co-creator Todd McFarlane publicly voiced skepticism that a film could succeed with a villain as its central figure, prompting some industry chatter suggesting Grace should return anyway, precisely because audiences seemed to like him in a villainous role. Wernick and Reese had pitched Sony their own original take on the character, one the pair later described as a more realistic and grounded interpretation with a darker edge than prior versions. Working alongside Sony and Marvel, who reportedly held firm guidelines about how the villain and his origin needed to be handled, the writers completed a full draft by April 2009. That draft reportedly included a part written specifically for Stan Lee and featured a memorable symbiote set piece in which the creature leapt from host to host across a city, with each new host turning violent before passing the creature along to the next victim. Wernick and Reese delivered a second draft that September, describing Sony's attitude toward the project as one of continued forward momentum, however uncertain the exact direction. A month later, Gary Ross, who at the time was also working on rewrites for a planned Spider Man 4, was brought on to rewrite the Venom script himself, direct the film, and produce it alongside Arad. By this point, Grace was considered unlikely to return, and the filmmakers were said to be starting over from scratch, this time aiming to reposition the villain as more of an anti hero who defends the innocent rather than menaces them. That plan was upended in January 2010 when Sony announced it was rebooting the Spider Man franchise entirely after Raimi opted not to continue directing sequels beyond the third film. Sony's interest in Venom persisted regardless. By March 2012, With the studio's rebooted franchise entry, The Amazing Spider Man on the horizon, executives still hope to capitalize on that reboot's momentum with a companion Venom film. Ross had since departed to direct The Hunger Games, so Sony entered negotiations with Josh Trank, fresh off the acclaim for his directorial debut Chronicle. Trank, together with big fan director Robert Siegel, pitched an R rated Venom film with a tone reminiscent of the 1994 comedy The Mask. But producer Matt Tolmach was unconvinced by their treatment, and the idea did not move forward. That June, Arad and Tolmach discussed the possibility of tying Venom into the Amazing Spider Man in the way Marvel Studios had begun crossing over its own films in the Avengers. Arad maintained that the project should remain an Eddie Brock story on its own terms, while Tolmach expressed hope that all of Sony's Spider Man adjacent properties might eventually coexist within a single shared world. That ambition crystallized in December 2013 when Sony revealed plans to use the Amazing Spider Man 2 as a launching pad for an expanded cinematic universe built from the various Marvel characters whose film rights the studio held, Venom among them. Arad and Tolmach were positioned to oversee this expanded slate as part of a so called franchise brain trust. And the studio lined up Alex Kurtzman, Roberto Orci, and Ed Solomon to write the Venom screenplay, with Kurtzman also attached to direct. By April 2014, the plan called for Venom to arrive after The Amazing Spider Man 3, itself slated for a May 2016 release and before a prospective fourth entry in that rebooted series. Those plans didn't survive contact with reality. The Amazing Spider Man 2 underperformed at the box office, and with mounting pressure on what was still Sony's most valuable franchise, the studio reassessed its entire approach to the shared universe. The Amazing Spider Man 3 slipped to 2018, while the Venom project, rebranded at that point as Venom Carnage, was accelerated to a 2017 release, still with Kurtzman attached to both write and direct alongside Solomon. Everything shifted again in February 2015 when Sony and Marvel Studios struck a new partnership under which Marvel would produce the next mainline Spider Man film for Sony and fold the character into the MCU proper. Sony indicated at the time that it still intended to develop its spin off films independently. But by that November, industry observers widely believed those spin offs, including the Kurtzman led Venom, had quietly been shelved so Sony could concentrate on its new Spider Man partnership with Marvel Studios. Venom was revived in March 2016. Arad and Tolmach returned as producers and screenwriter. Dante Harper was brought on to write an entirely new script. This new iteration of the project was conceived as a standalone film that would launch its own franchise, separate from the Spider Man films. Sony was now co developing with Marvel Studios. A year on, in March 2017, Sony set an October 5, 2018 release date and clarified that Kurtzman was no longer involved. No director had yet been attached, and the writing duties had shifted to Scott Rosenberg and Jeff Pinkner. At this stage, Sony was reportedly aiming for an R rating on a comparatively modest budget, taking inspiration from 20th Century Fox's success, doing exactly that with Deadpool and Logan within its X Men universe. Names floated for the director's chair included Adi Shankar, known for gritty, R rated fan interpretations of properties he'd grown up with, and Adam Wingard. The following month, Sony confirmed that Tom Hardy would star as Eddie Brock and Venom, with Ruben Fleischer set to direct and the film positioned to formally kick off a new interconnected universe, eventually christened Sony's Spider Man universe. Fleischer landed the job after what was reportedly an extensive search on Sony's part. And as a long standing fan of the character, he was drawn to the visual possibilities of bringing Venom to life on screen, as well as to the thematic richness of the character's duality. Before Fleischer's hiring, director David F. Sandberg had also met with Sony to discuss the film, going as far as reading the script, but he had already been courted by Warner Bros. To direct the DC film Shazam, and ultimately chose that project instead, largely because its crew included several collaborators from his time at New Line Cinema. Fleischer described the intended dynamic between Eddie and the symbiote as something distinct from familiar dual identity archetypes, like the werewolf or the Jekyll and Hyde split personality. characterizing it instead as a genuine hybrid in which two separate beings share one body and eventually work in concert. Hardy found that duality especially appealing and drew an unlikely comparison between Eddie and Venom's bickering partnership and the classic animated duo Ren and Stimpy. To distinguish the two voices sharing Hardy's performance, the actor gave Eddie what he described as an easygoing, aw shucks American accent, while voicing Venom himself with a lower lounge singer quality he likened to James Brown, a vocal choice later processed and modulated in post production to sound considerably more sinister on screen. Hardy characterized Eddie himself as a flawed anti hero, willing to do whatever was necessary to accomplish his goals. Actor Brad Venable also contributed additional voice work for Venom, recording pained grunts and other vocalizations that were blended together with Hardy's own performance for certain lines of dialogue, including the character's signature declaration, "We are Venom." Riz Ahmed, cast as Carlton Drake, described his character as someone convinced he was working to safeguard humanity's future through his research into the symbiotes, a self image Fleischer complicated by noting that while Drake's underlying goal was genuinely positive, the character's willingness to experiment on unwilling human subjects introduced a real moral ambiguity to his motivations. Michelle Williams, meanwhile, was reportedly enthusiastic about the prospect of her character and eventually becoming She Venom, mirroring a transformation the character undergoes in the comics. And Fleischer felt that briefly showing Anne Bond with the symbiote during one sequence in the finished film would make for a fun Easter egg for longtime fans. The moment was kept under wraps ahead of the film's release, and Fleischer expressed hope that a positive audience reaction to the brief tease might eventually lead to a larger She Venom presence in future Venom films, or even a dedicated spin off built around the character. Williams also contributed directly to the script's dialogue, adding Anne's line, "I love you, but I love myself more," as a deliberate nod to the broader cultural conversation surrounding the Me Too movement at that time. Hardy's casting reportedly came together quickly. His son was said to be a big fan of the Venom character, and the actor had just exited J.C. Chandor's Triple Frontier that April, giving Sony an opening to pursue an in demand star. Hardy was paid a reported $7 million dollars for the role, and in preparation, he trained for 5 weeks in mixed martial arts, boxing, and jiu jitsu. Casting continued to fill out through the back half of 2017. Riz Ahmed entered talks to join the film that August. Other actors said to have been considered for the same role, which eventually became Carlton Drake, included Matt Smith, Pedro Pascal, and Matthias Hoenertz. The following month, Michelle Williams entered negotiations for a role initially described as a district attorney and Eddie's love interest, a part that would become Anne Weying. Tatiana Maslany and Lashana Lynch also reportedly auditioned for roles in the film. By October, Jenny Slate, Reed Scott, and Scott Hayes were all in negotiations to join the cast, with Slate up for the part of a Life Foundation scientist. Around the same time, screenwriter Kelly Marcel came aboard to write a fresh draft of the script. The film's final production budget settled at $100 million, dollars, though Deadline Hollywood later reported that Chinese production company Tencent Pictures had covered roughly a third of that sum as part of a co-financing arrangement with Sony. The film's relationship to Marvel Studios' MCU was a recurring point of confusion during development. In June 2017, Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige stated plainly that Venom was strictly a Sony project with no plans for MCU crossover. Producer Amy Pascal offered a somewhat different characterization not long after, describing Sony's slate of films as existing in the same world as the MCU Spider-Man, Homecoming, calling them adjunct to that world, and suggesting that Venom would eventually connect to another planned SSU entry, the unproduced Silver and Black, with the possibility that Tom Holland's MCU Spider-Man could appear in either film. At that point, the villain Carnage was also expected to factor into the story. The following month, Columbia Pictures president Sanford Panich explained that Sony was deliberately avoiding a conventional comic book movie approach, instead aiming to give each film in its planned series its own distinct identity. He described Venom specifically as a spin on horror cinema, citing the influence of John Carpenter and David Cronenberg, tempered with more pop and fun. Fleischer echoed this sentiment, noting his long-standing pull toward anti-hero driven superhero stories and citing the dark wit he found appealing about Venom, while framing the film as an exploration of the character's origin and the Jekyll and Hyde dynamic between Eddie and the symbiote. Creatively, the film drew primarily from two comic sources: the 1993 miniseries Venom, Lethal Protector, and the 1995 story arc Planet of the Symbiotes, the former of which lent the film its San Francisco setting. Spider Man's absence from the story wasn't a creative preference so much as a contractual reality, since Sony's deal loaning the character to Marvel Studios meant he couldn't appear in a non MCU film. That constraint pushed the writers toward a version of Venom largely untethered from Spider Man's mythology, which in turn led them to the ultimate Marvel Comics take on the character, whose origin doesn't depend on Peter Parker at all. Pinkner and Rosenberg were informed of the no Spider Man restriction before they even pitched their take on the project, and they approached the challenge by trying to remain faithful to the spirit of the source material, even where specific plot elements had to change, retaining, for instance, Eddie's journalistic ethical lapse from his comic book origin story. Fleischer felt that Lethal Protector was especially useful groundwork, since, as Venom's first solo ongoing series, it had already proven the character could function independently of Spider Man, giving the filmmakers a foundation to lean into Venom's more heroic dimension rather than his traditional villainy. Though Fleischer would later describe the finished film as one without any conventional heroes at all. One line of Venom's dialogue in the finished film about so many snacks, so little time was lifted essentially verbatim from a 1993 issue of The Amazing Spider Man comic. Fleischer described the filmmaker's ambitions during development as building toward a large, densely populated world featuring multiple characters, including other symbiotes, such as the eventual film's antagonist, Riot. He wanted the finished movie to feel distinct from other studios' comic book output, avoiding both the brighter tone associated with the MCU and the more somber register of the DC Extended Universe. Honoring the character's comic book violence mattered to him as well. He later remarked that it would feel strange to depict Venom without at least gesturing at the character's grislier comic book tendencies, such as biting off heads and eating brains. Sony's executives, however, were wary of pushing the violence far enough to earn an R rating, worried it would complicate future crossovers with the family friendly Spider Man franchise and other MCU properties. The finished film ultimately received a PG-13 rating, with much of its more graphic violence dialed back in the process. Producer Matt Tolmach spoke about the broader philosophy guiding the writers as they adapted Eddie's comic book origins for the screen, describing the character as a journalist who lands himself in serious trouble through his own choices, and framing the studio's overall approach to its Marvel derived characters as one of staying close to established comic book lore and emotional truth while allowing the surrounding story to take on a life of its own. Fleischer, for his part, has cited a specific line from the comics as a touchstone for how he wanted the finished film to depict the relationship between man and symbiote. The idea that Eddie Brock and the alien organism sharing his body are, together, Venom rather than one simply controlling the other. That notion of partnership rather than possession shaped much of how Fleischer approached both the writing and the eventual visual language of the character, informing decisions about how the pair would talk to each other on screen and how their evolving dynamic would carry the film's emotional through line from origin story to eventual alliance. Filming principal photography began on October 23, 2017, with the earliest stretch of shooting taking place across Atlanta and New York City. Matthew Libatic took on cinematography duties as director of photography, while production designer Oliver Shaw, who had previously worked on Spider Man Homecoming, carried over to design Venom's world. Michelle Williams officially joined the production that November because she was also potentially needed for last minute reshoots on All the Money in the World. Sony had to carefully coordinate her schedule to keep both productions on track. By December, Woody Harrelson had entered talks to join the film, and Williams' casting as Anne Weying was publicly confirmed. One recurring subplot around the shoot involved Tom Holland's Spider-Man. According to multiple reports, Holland spent several days on the Venom set filming a cameo appearance as Peter Parker, only for Marvel Studios to ask Sony to remove the scene from the finished film, a later account reported by journalist Adam B. Vary in December 2024 offered a different version of events. According to a Sony source, Disney had never actually barred Sony from using either the Peter Parker character or Holland himself in the Venom franchise, pointing to the fact that Sony's own animated film, Spider Man, Into the Spider Verse had already featured multiple versions of Spider Man that same year. Under this telling, Sony chose on its own not to include Holland, believing audiences might reject or misunderstand his MCU Spider Man showing up in a film outside the MCU proper, a concern that reportedly grew sharper after the multiverse rules established later by Spider Man, No Way Home, and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. On set, Hardy developed a distinctive process for voicing Venom. He recorded his lines for the symbiote each morning before shooting began, and those recordings were then played back to him through an earpiece during scenes requiring Eddie and Venom to converse with each other. Hardy had used a similar technique previously while playing dual roles in the 2015 film Legend. Fleischer gave Hardy considerable latitude to improvise during filming and to steer scenes in directions he felt were right in the moment. In one frequently cited example, Hardy noticed a lobster tank on a restaurant set and decided his character should climb into it. The production design team reportedly worked through the night, reinforcing the tank and filling it with fake lobsters so the scene could be shot the next day. Hardy also collaborated directly with Kelly Marcel throughout production to rework dialogue for both Eddie and Venom as filming progressed. Additional filming took the production to San Francisco from January 16 to 26, 2018, with locations spanning Russian Hill, North Beach, Chinatown, and the financial district. Hardy completed his work on the film on January 27. In February, Ahmed and Reed Scott's casting was publicly confirmed, alongside news that Will Ball had contributed additional writing to the script. Over the following months, further cast additions were revealed, including Sope Aluko and Scott Deckard, followed by confirmation that Hayes and Harrelson would appear in the film and that Ahmed would specifically play Carlton Drake. Harrelson, who had previously collaborated with Fleischer on Zombieland, signed on for what he described as a relatively small role in this film, understanding that a prospective sequel would give his character, eventually revealed to be Cletus Kasady, more to do. Beyond the principal cast, the production filled out its ensemble with a wide array of supporting performers across its various shooting blocks. Jenny Slate ultimately played Life Foundation scientist Dora Skirth, while Melora Walters took on the role of Maria, a homeless woman who briefly hosts the Venom symbiote before Eddie does, and Chris O'Hara appeared as astronaut John Jameson, who briefly hosts the villainous Riot symbiote during its journey to Earth. Additional smaller roles went to Sam Medina, playing a thug who confronts Venom directly, Peggy Lou as convenience store owner Mrs. Chen, Michelle Lee as a Malaysian emergency medical technician who briefly hosts Riot, Soap Aluko and Wayne Pere as Life Foundation scientists, Scott Deckard as an obnoxious neighbor of Eddie's, and Emilio Rivera as a security guard who is friendly with Eddie. Actor Ron Cephas Jones also appears uncredited as Eddie's newspaper boss. Two cameo appearances were built into the film's closing stretch, specifically to seed future installments and tie the movie into Sony's wider plans. Woody Harrelson appears in the film's mid-credits scene as Cletus Kasady, confirming the character teased earlier through Harrelson's casting, while Marvel Comics figurehead Stan Lee makes his traditional cameo as a dog walker who briefly speaks with Eddie. The film also closes with a short clip lifted from the animated film Spider-Man, Into the Spider-Verse, released later that same year, featuring Shamik Moore's Miles Morales and Jake Johnson's Peter B. Parker. Commentators at the time read the inclusion of this footage as a deliberate signal from the filmmakers and studio that Venom's world and the animated Spider-Verse existed within the same larger multiverse. Despite Venom's otherwise total separation from Tom Holland's MCU continuity, the production underwent a further round of reshoots in Los Angeles in June 2018, reportedly overseen in part by Hardy himself. Venom was among the earliest productions to make use of newly built post production facilities inside Sony Pictures Stage 6, building in Culver City, California, which by that point included two theaters outfitted for Dolby Atmos sound design, two additional stages equipped with Avid Pro Tools workstations for sound mixing, and a dedicated theater set up for remote review of visual effects and color grading. Post production editors Marianne Brandon and Alan Baumgarten cut the film together. Fleischer has said his central goal throughout the editing process was to sharpen and cultivate the evolving relationship between Eddie and Venom, which he regarded as the emotional core of the entire movie. The film's opening sequence went through numerous iterations before landing on its final form. Fleischer was insistent that the movie needed to start with a bang, which ultimately led to the spaceship crash that opens the film. The symbiote itself appears not long after, introduced essentially as the film's hero before the story shift focus to the villain's plans. Visual effects house Dineji handled the film's effects work, with Paul Franklin serving as visual effects supervisor and concept artist Paolo Giandoso contributing designs for Dineji's effects team. Giandoso played a significant role in shaping the designs for both Venom and Riot, and produced a sequence of 158 individual drawings mapping out the climactic battle between the two characters. The effects team's first major task was establishing a visual language for the symbiotes, creatures that lack any fixed body shape in the comics. Franklin has said the goal was to make them feel predatory and threatening, and the team drew inspiration from slime molds, jellyfish, and time lapse footage of amoebas while developing the look. The symbiotes ultimately took the form of shape shifting blobs with a layer of simulated soft tissue on top, intended to give them an abstract, unsettling quality. To merge the creature with Hardy's Eddie Brock, the effects team added tentacle like appendages to his body through a combination of practical effects and digital work. These tentacles were inspired by the movement of marine animals and by scientific demonstrations of non Newtonian fluids. Additional cameras positioned on set captured Hardy's movements precisely enough that the tentacle effects could be seamlessly integrated with his live performance, aided by a detailed digital double built specifically for that purpose. Several partial or transitional versions of Venom appear throughout the film beyond the fully formed creature. A freak out form, used for moments when the symbiote is being forcibly shaken loose from Eddie's body, was achieved by overlaying a ghostly animated version of the character on top of Hardy's live performance, combined with a vibration effect. A separate wraith form, in which Venom's head emerges from Eddie's body to speak with him directly, was designed to sit closer to the raw, undifferentiated symbiote than to the fully realized Venom character, incorporating added tendrils, visible veins, and a gaunt, snake like take on the character's face. The fully humanoid version of Venom was built as a digital model, complete with custom rigging and muscle simulation for the face. In the film's internal logic, the character stands 7 feet 7 inches tall and weighs roughly 500 pounds, rendered with a smooth, oily black surface. Because Venom's appearance varies considerably from one comic artist to the next, and even from panel to panel within the same comic, the design team worked to distill what they considered the character's essential visual traits into something that could hold up as photorealistic on screen. The eyes were a particular focus. Franklin compared their design to a killer whale's, and because the character lacks visible pupils, the team had to animate the eyes with exaggerated movement simply to communicate where Venom was looking at any given moment. The character's long tongue, likewise adapted from the comics, required its own elaborate rig, so it could be animated with precision and retracted convincingly whenever Venom needed to speak without the tongue getting in the way, an effect Franklin felt would otherwise look unintentionally comical. When Venom does talk, he typically speaks through clenched teeth, a stylistic choice inspired by the screen performances of Jack Palance and Clint Eastwood. Because the film's version of Venom isn't tied to Spider Man's mythology, the filmmakers decided against giving the character the spider symbol chest, marking familiar from the comics. An entirely black character risked becoming difficult to make out in the film's numerous night scenes, though. So, the design team instead gave Venom a subtle V shape on his chest, formed from lighter veins running through the symbiote's body, to further help the character read clearly on screen. The effects team lit him in a manner similar to how a car might be lit in a commercial, relying on reflections to define the contours of his body. The digital character model was built to be highly adjustable, letting animators scale Venom's head, lengthen his teeth, or unhinge his jaw like a trapdoor, depending on what a given shot called for. Hardy had initially hoped to perform Venom himself on set using motion capture in addition to playing Eddie, but that plan was abandoned once it became clear how different his facial features were from the character's intended design. A stand in performer measuring 6 feet 10 inches, wearing a helmet to approximate Venom's greater height, was sometimes used on set as a physical reference for the character. Riot, being a much more obscure figure from the source comics, gave the design team considerably more creative freedom than Venom did. In the film, the character stands roughly a foot taller than Venom and weighs nearly twice as much, rendered with what Franklin described as a brutal, almost reptilian metallic quality. Riot's character model shared a foundation with Venom's, but used fewer effects layers overall, since the character lacked the same rippling, viscous texture built into Venom's design. Riot was also given a bespoke set of weapon effects, including blade like protrusions and a massive spiked wrecking ball he could manifest at will. The climactic fight between the two characters evolved continuously throughout post production, developed collaboratively between Franklin, the wider DNAG team, and the pre visualization artists at the third floor working alongside Fleischer. One idea that emerged from the visual effects teams was to let the two liquid based characters visually merge mid fight, creating a swirling mass of symbiotic material with glimpses of the two human hosts revealed through the churn, an idea rooted in early visual tests conducted while the basic symbiote look was still being developed. In designing the launchpad setting for that final confrontation, Franklin aimed for something broad, colorful, and exciting, meant to reflect the film's more playful, comic book inflected sensibility, a deliberate contrast to the tonally different visual approach he had taken on Interstellar and was concurrently taking on First Man. Additional environment work by DNAG included digitally removing Coca Cola advertising and CNN branding from sequences shot in Atlanta, since neither would plausibly appear in the film's San Francisco setting. For the brief sequence in which Anne hosts the symbiote as Shivinom, Franklin noted that the character's various comic book depictions range from outright demonic designs with elongated teeth to exaggerated, hypertrophied female forms, and that the films take aim for a balance between grotesque and, in his words, a little bit sexy, particularly during her kiss with Eddie. In total, DNAG completed approximately 100 visual effects shots for the finished film, a workload that reflected just how central the symbiote characters were to nearly every major set piece. From Eddie's earliest transformation sequences through the climactic battle atop the launch pad, the sheer number of distinct partial forms the design team had to maintain consistency across, ranging from the fully humanoid Venom to the wraith like emergent head, the vibrating freak out state, and Riot's separate reptilian design, meant that DNAG's artists were effectively managing several interconnected character pipelines simultaneously rather than a single creature design, a scope of work that shaped much of the film's post production timeline heading into its theatrical release. Music composer Ludwig Göransson signed on to score Venom in March 2018, marking a reunion with Fleischer following their earlier collaboration on the 2011 comedy 30 Minutes or Less. The assignment came at a notably busy moment in Goransson's career, arriving shortly after he had also composed the acclaimed score for Marvel Studios' Black Panther earlier that same year, making Venom his second Marvel adjacent film score within a matter of months. The film's soundtrack picked up an unexpected boost that August when rapper Eminem teased that he had recorded a new song tied to the movie. His 10th studio album, Kamikaze, arrived at the end of that month and included a bonus track titled Venom that directly references the film and its title character. The song itself was subsequently released as a standalone digital single on September 21, 2018, ahead of the film's theatrical debut. Meanwhile, an album collecting Goranson's original score was issued digitally through Sony Classical Records on the same day the film opened in the United States, October 5, with a corresponding physical release following later that month. Goranson has described the assignment as a long-time professional ambition, realized, noting that composing for a superhero film was something he had wanted to do since early in his career, given how effectively superhero themes tend to resonate with audiences. As a self described fan of the Venom comics going into the project, he found the job of scoring two volatile characters occupying a single body to be a genuinely interesting creative puzzle, one that required him to establish two distinct musical identities for Eddie and the symbiote individually before gradually interweaving them as the character's relationship deepens over the course of the story. To achieve that effect, Goranson drew heavily on his own background as a metal guitarist, aiming to reinvent metal instrumentation using modern production techniques while layering in the scale and power of a full orchestra. The resulting score leans aggressively into its action driven cues, particularly during extended set pieces, such as the film's climactic battle sequence, with comparatively few quieter, more restrained passages, breaking up its otherwise relentless intensity. Sony's marketing campaign for Venom kicked off well over a year before release, with Fleischer and Hardy appearing in a video film on set to promote the project at Comic Con Experience in December 2017. The film's first teaser trailer followed in February 2018, and the response was decidedly mixed. Danny DiPlacido, writing for Forbes, described the teaser as underwhelming to the point of unintentional comedy, arguing that it represented a significant misstep for Sony, given that the teaser's job was ostensibly to win over Spider Man fans, who remained skeptical of the character following his portrayal in Spider Man 3. A recurring criticism across multiple outlets centered on the fact that the teaser never actually showed the title character himself. Sony chairman Tom Rothman later acknowledged this criticism directly, explaining that the studio's intention had simply been to build anticipation ahead of a fuller reveal. Fleischer offered his own explanation that August, noting that the character's visual effects simply hadn't been finished in time to include him in the earlier marketing materials. That changed at CinemaCon 2018, where Rothman unveiled new footage that finally showed off the film's take on Venom, quipping to the audience that Sony had, in fact, remembered to put Venom in the movie. DiPlacido responded far more favorably to this second trailer, praising the character's visual design while still expressing some reservations about the dialogue. That same trailer also became an unlikely viral moment for an entirely different reason. Actress Jenny Slate pronounced the word symbiote as symbiote rather than the more commonly expected symbiote, sparking widespread online debate. According to Merriam-Webster, searches for symbiote pronunciation spiked by roughly 35,700% in the wake of the trailer's release, though the dictionary noted that both pronunciations are technically considered acceptable. Slate uses the more conventional pronunciation in the finished film, which led many commentators to assume the line had either been reshot or redubbed. Fleischer later clarified that the correction had actually been made on set during filming and that the marketing team had simply pulled an earlier take for the trailer made before the correction. Screen Rant's Hannah Shaw Williams also flagged that the trailer reused a piece of music from a recent high profile trailer for Marvel Studios' Avengers Infinity War, questioning whether the choice was coincidental or a deliberate attempt by Sony to associate Venom with the MCU in viewers' minds, while cautioning that the film would need more than borrowed trailer music to win audiences over. Data from the analytics firm Physiology found that this second trailer racked up 3 million views within its first 24 hours online, a 72% jump over the first trailer's performance, an unusually large increase for a second trailer relative to a first. The firm also reported a 46% rise in generally positive responses, with much of that positivity directed specifically at Venom's design and appearance. Fleischer, Hardy, and Ahmed brought the promotional campaign to San Diego Comic Con that summer, where attendees were handed Venom masks and led in a "We Are Venom" chant during the panel. New footage debuted at the event as well, including the first reveal of the villain Riot. A third trailer followed shortly after, drawing a much harsh response from Forbes critic Scott Mendelson, who compared the film unfavorably to the widely mocked 2004 film Catwoman, calling that earlier film the textbook example of how not to approach this kind of movie. Mendelsohn also pointed to Fleischer's decision to direct a sequel to his hit comedy, Zombieland, ahead of Venom's release as a sign, in his view, that the studio itself lacked confidence in the film. Richard Newby, writing for The Hollywood Reporter, offered a different but still skeptical take, arguing the marketing made the film feel like a throwback to an earlier cinematic era, describing it as looking pre Iron Man cool and drawing comparisons to An American Werewolf in London and Blade rather than to any contemporary superhero franchise. Newby did note, however, that this latest trailer had put to rest earlier concerns about Venom's screen time. Since it was now clear the character would feature heavily throughout, and he suggested that the film's deliberate distance from any shared universe scaffolding, along with its distinct tone, might ultimately help Sony demonstrate that it understood how to handle these characters. Alongside the trailers, Marvel Comics released a digital tie-in comic book on September 14, functioning as both a prequel and promotional teaser for the film. A physical edition was made available to fans who purchased advance tickets through AMC Theaters, written by Sean Ryan with art by Shimon Kudransky and cover art by SKN. The comic filled in additional backstory for the symbiote ahead of the film's release. Venom held its world premiere at the Regency Village Theater in Westwood, Los Angeles on October 1, 2018. It then opened theatrically across the United States and Canada on October 5, playing in 4,250 theaters. That US release followed openings in a number of other international markets. 2 days earlier, on October 3, where the film played on roughly 20,800 screens worldwide during its opening weekend, including 726 IMAX theaters spread across 60 markets across its opening weeks. The film's rollout followed a staggered international pattern, typical of major studio tentpoles, with certain markets receiving the film ahead of North America and others, most significantly China, following considerably later due to that country's separate approval and quota process for foreign releases. China represented a notable exception to this rollout. The film didn't open there until November 9, a release date approved by the country's film regulatory board following an unexpected downturn in Chinese box office receipts earlier in 2018. China subsequently granted the film a rare extended theatrical run that December, a decision widely attributed to Venom's strong box office showing in the country, combined with Tencent's significant financial stake in the production. The extension added an additional 30 days on top of the film's original 30-day theatrical window. Home Media Sony Pictures Home Entertainment released Venom digitally on December 11, 2018, followed a week later on December 18 by Ultra HD Blu-ray, Standard Blu-ray, and DVD editions in the United States. These physical releases came packed with bonus content, including deleted and extended scenes and behind-the-scenes featurettes, along with a special viewing mode, branded Venom mode, which layered informative pop-up text over the film as it played notably. Sony's marketing for these home media editions leaned into a very different framing than the theatrical campaign had, positioning the film essentially as a romantic comedy centered on the relationship between Eddie and Venom. That repositioning marked a fairly dramatic departure from the darker, horror inflected marketing language the studio had used throughout the film's theatrical rollout, and it arrived only after months of fan driven online discussion had already reframed the Eddie Venom dynamic in exactly those romantic comedy terms. Rather than continuing to sell the film as a conventional anti hero origin story, the home media campaign embraced the Venom mode commentary track and its accompanying bonus features as an extension of that same tonal shift, giving audiences a more explicitly comedic lens through which to revisit the film's central relationship on a second viewing. Several years later, in April 2021, Sony entered into a licensing agreement with Disney, granting Disney access to a portion of Sony's film library, including titles from Sony's Spider Man universe, for streaming on Disney Plus and Hulu, as well as broadcast on Disney's linear television networks. Under the terms of that deal, Disney's access to these titles would begin only after the films had completed a prior window of exclusivity on Netflix. Venom eventually arrived on Disney Plus in the United States on May 12, 2023, followed by a Canadian debut on the service later that year. On September 8, 2023, reception box office Venom grossed $213.5 million across the United States and Canada, adding a further $642.5 million from international markets for a worldwide total of $856.1 million. Against a reported production budget of somewhere between $100 million and $116 million, Deadline Hollywood estimated the film needed to gross roughly $350 million just to break even once marketing and distribution costs were factored in. The outlet later calculated the film's actual net profit at $246.9 million once all expenses and revenues were tallied, ranking it as the sixth most profitable release of 2018 industry-wide. Domestically, pre-release tracking had projected an opening weekend in the range of dollars to $70 million. The film blew past those early estimates almost immediately. Thursday night preview screenings brought in $10 million, the highest total ever recorded for an October release at the time, surpassing the previous record of $8 million set by Paranormal Activity 3 in 2011. A $32.7 million single-day haul on its official opening Friday prompted analysts to revise weekend projections upward to around $80 million. And the film ultimately delivered $80.3 million over its opening weekend, the best October opening of all time in North America, eclipsing Gravity's $55.8 million debut from 2013 and the seventh best opening weekend ever for a film released by Sony. Riding that momentum into the Columbus Day holiday, Venom earned an additional $9.6 million on the Monday itself, setting a new record for the best October Monday gross and once again surpassing Gravity's prior mark. The film held on to the top spot at the domestic box office the following weekend as well, though its total dropped 55% to $35.7 million. It slipped to third place over its third and fourth weekends, trailing behind the horror sequel Halloween and the musical drama A Star is Born. As additional new releases entered the marketplace over the following weeks, Venom continued to slide down the chart, falling to sixth place in its fifth weekend and eighth place in its sixth, with that sixth weekend pushing the film's domestic cumulative total past the $200 million mark.